A common mistake made by new pilots is to push forward on the yoke after landing, in a misguided attempt to stick the airplane onto the runway. This is called a wheelbarrow landing because in extreme cases it can actually cause the main wheels to rise up in the air and the airplane to ride down the runway on its nose like a wheelbarrow. This is a potentially dangerous mistake and often leads to loss of directional control because pushing forward on the yoke makes the aircraft unstable and yaw and want to pivot easily around its nose wheel. It's important in small tricycle gear aircraft that back pressure is maintained throughout the landing rollout because the downforce created by the wind flowing over the tail transfers weight away from the nose wheel and onto the mains. Pushing forward on the stick has the opposite effect. It transfers weight away from the main wheels and onto the nose wheel. The reason this leads to loss of directional control is because the aircraft's center of gravity is between the main wheels and the nose wheel. With weight on the main wheels, the friction force between the runway and the rubber of the tires is pulling backward against the CG. But with the weight on the nose wheel, the friction force is in front of the CG pushing backward against it. Keeping the CG in front of the friction force leads to stability and yaw. If a wind gust or bad rudder input from the pilot causes the longitudinal axis to tilt a little bit, momentum will just pull it back into alignment. But with the friction force in front of the CG, any change in yaw leads to more change in yaw in the same direction. A momentary upset causes the friction force and momentum to get out of alignment, which tends to rotate the aircraft around its vertical axis. This is called a ground loop, and it's primarily something tailwheel pilots have to worry about, because tailwheels always have the friction force in front of the CG. Fortunately, tricycle gear pilots don't have to worry about ground looping very much, at least as long as they keep the weight on the mains for the full duration of the rollout. And ground looping isn't the only bad thing that can happen if they don't. With the stick forward, any use of brakes usually results in skidding of the tires, because there's not much weight holding them on the runway. You also run the risk of damaging the nose wheel, since it isn't as reinforced as the mains and isn't very good at absorbing impact. Wheelbarrow landings have plagued rusty pilots for as long as tricycle gear airplanes have been around, because it's a very tempting mistake. The FAA released an advisory circular on this topic way back in 1968, and that advice has since been consolidated into the Airplane Flying Handbook in a section on faulty approaches and landings.